Hello everyone, welcome to the What If Anime YouTube channel. Today, we are diving into an exciting new story that will take your imagination to the next level. Let's get started. Today we will see what if Naruto's silent genius. The day was quiet as clouds slowly set in over Konoha, sun rising gently over the seemingly peaceful village. The air was thick, and the fog that was settling in comfortably was seemingly dense enough to cut with a knife. A boy of 5 was wandering the outskirt of the village, lingering on the forest wall, walking a few feet before coming to a sudden stop and whirling around wildly, his eyes accusing, just daring someone to be there. The pattern repeated until he sighed with heavy frustration. He knew that he was being followed, and by someone who could mask their chakra incredibly well to the point almost he couldn't detect it. He knew the person had been watching him, and he still couldn't actually see them every time he felt them come out of hiding. They were fast, very fast and tricky, dangerous. He quickly felt the growing apprehension, well aware of the various attempts on his life. The sudden need to get home hit him full force, and he nonchalantly made his way back into the city. When the stranger didn't attack, he felt confused. Why wait? It would be much easier to kill him unknowingly to the rest of the village while outside of it. He shrugged it off and still continued to his apartment, which he had quickly rented after being thrown, literally, from the orphanage. The money was most certainly not easy to obtain. He still felt the presence, and was so focused on it he had accidentally walked straight into the leg of one villager. He froze, and looked up to the man he had walked into. He straightened and placed his hands at his side, bowing slightly. "Gomenasai," he spoke quietly and uncertain, hoping the fog would hide his face to the point that he would not be recognized. "It's the demon child." A sigh slipped his mouth as he slipped back into his lazy, usual walking style, hands stuffed into his foo. Great. He stopped his mind swearing, as he had come to dub it. The words he had picked up from some of the other kids in the orphanage earned him no light in the eyes of the owners, and he had it beaten out of him. It had come as a realization to him that it was probably not a good thing, and he couldn't seem to stop until he did so in his mind as well. Thus began his daily exercise, running from the villagers of Konoha. God, he hated them. Even with the very meager self-taught skills, he knew full well he could slaughter quite a few in the group of people who chased him every day, before a shinobi showed up, at least. So he began a run at an easy jogging pace. For him at least, being kicked out of the orphanage 2 years ago left him vulnerable to the villagers who still had resentment towards the Kyuubi, and had absolutely no understanding of seals, seeing him as the demon itself. He had been running multiple times, every day, across the entire town. He had the heart of an Olympic runner, the legs of a horse, and knew multiple conditioning techniques if he ever got tired. Then the Kyuubi, whom he had met just a year ago. Needless to say, they had not given each other a good impression. The Kyuubi had basically tried to manipulate him into releasing him, and he played the stupid act, much to the hidden agitation of the Kyuubi. They had not talked much after that. After 5 minutes of outrunning the mob by 5 feet exactly, dodging things thrown in an attempt to catch him, he was cornered in an alley. He was so lost in thought that he hadn't noticed them corner him, and he sighed. Showing skills other than running would be a problem. The villagers took a step towards him, so would being beaten. He looked at the villagers and his eyes widened slightly with disgust, as they cheered as they approached him. "We got it. Finally we can give this demon what it deserves. Skin it and hang its corpse above the village gate as a warning to any other demons to confront us." He felt the bubbling, burning, murderous feeling of hatred build up within him. Then it disappeared into sorrow as he listened to them some more. "You could at least refer to my gender. I'm just an it, huh?" he whispered, half to himself. The feeling of hatred returned. "I'm just a demon, huh?" His voice rose as he addressed the crowd, keeping the tone of anger out of his voice. "I'll show you what this demon can do." His voice became ice, and he let the full bearing of hatred, anger, and sorrow crash upon the mob. A wave of killing intent paled most of the mob, and froze their bones. Lesser of the mob collapsed to their knees, held their head, and cried out in pain, their companions trying to help them with fail. He had to suppress a grin, a solemn smile breaking its way onto his face. He had to admit that he felt bad seeing some of the elder men and women in pain. He had to lower his gaze onto the ground and closed his eyes, blocking his view of the villagers. His eyes snapped open as he felt the presence that had been following him begin to move onto his position, fast. A gasp escaped his throat as a man appeared in front of him and began to reach for him, most likely to restrain him. His legs moved out of instinct and he jumped up to the wall, kicking off with enough force to propel him across to the other wall quickly, and repeated until he was on the roof, fleeing to his apartment. He could only hope that his sudden use of the skill had stunned the man, and left him to shocked to follow immediately. It was his only chance. The yank of the back of his worn shirt nearly strangled him, and his face meeting the ceramic tile of an only fairly slanted roof made his eyes roll into the back of his head as darkness took him. Damn it, little boy. If it wasn't for the interference of that damn shinobi that had been tracking you, you would have been going through the transformations at this point. I could have been released. You would have slain those villagers who pester you every day and gotten your first taste of blood. The Kyuubi was, to say the least, pissed. Possibly his one and only chance to escape. No, there would be more. He was sure of it, and conned. Then his mind drifted to his previous thoughts. Why had he cared about this boy? Sure, he had wanted to escape, and he would have utilized the chance to take over amidst the boy's unconsciousness, if not for the shock of it all. He knew how the boy played stupid. He knew how the boy had let them push him around. He had definitely not expected the boy to snap like he did. His thoughts were not calm and collected, they were all screaming to kill. A knowing smile flashed his face, as he knew he would be released soon, but deep down he knew he was worried for the boy. He was stable mental-wise, but had nightmares every time he closed his eyes to rest. Maybe I should make those damn shinobi more aware of this fact? It would certainly be fun to watch. And so he did, sending nightmares to the boy's mind, which were as much as the seal allowed him to do. With remorse he watched the event play out quietly, at the back of his mind hoping that they would do something. He didn't exactly know what, he just wanted them to do something. The pain, coursing through the quite vivid memories, which were in the forms of dreams, entered his mind. His skin burned as the cold metal slid across his skin slowly, leaving an open, bleeding wound in its wake. It was shallow, but God, it hurt. He bit down hard on the rag in his mouth. Any attempt to scream he knew would be a waste of much-needed energy, as they were currently out of the village, a fair amount into the forest which surrounded. He glanced down at the fresh blood oozing out of the second wound on his body, disregarding the numerous bruises. His head jerked to the side, and his neck screamed in response, threatening to break under the force of the hit. Darkness began to encroach the edge of his vision, and his eyes were starting to roll. No, he wouldn't die like this. He straightened his vision at his attackers, pre-grown men with a fair amount of training as shinobi. His face hurt, and blood trickled from his mouth as his breath came in short, shallow gasps. He mentally laughed. He was like a fish gasping for air after being ripped from its natural habitat. He was dizzy and slowly began to fade as the men suddenly moved away, laughing with merriment after looking over their victim. Kill me, he wanted to groan out, but his head lolled as he slipped unconscious, the Kyuubi's chakra already starting to heal his wounds at a rapid pace, as any slower and the boy would die. He awoke, but kept his eyes closed. The feeling of strong arms on his shoulders, and the familiar feeling of sweat quickly came to him, along with the Hokage's voice. Hold him down, I said, hold him down. He was slightly taken aback. He hadn't known Gigi could yell like that, and it scared him. Could he be like the rest? No, he banished the thought, finally realizing he had been thrashing around from the nightmare. He settled himself and curiously opened his eyes, wincing at the effect of the sun shining through the window and into his eyes. Damn sun was a marksman at millions of miles away. He turned his head to the right, and was greeted with the sight of a man wearing a dog mask. He blinked in recognition. Anbu, Gigi's office. He turned his head to the left and was greeted with the worried face of Hiruzen Saritobi, the Sandame Hokage. Most would consider it an honor to have the worried face of the Hokage hovering over them when they awoke, but he found it downright creepy. Gigi, what are you doing? He said cheerfully and confusedly, glancing to the Anbu with a calculating gaze before he smiled with closed eyes. Dog-san, what are you doing? He repeated in the exact same tone, raising his arm as if going to pet a dog on the head, his own mask, his first line of defense, the fool, just finishing being cemented in place. Cut the bullshit, was the reply. Neither were amused it seemed, but the pure bluntness of it just surprised him outright. What? He asked somewhat dumbly, his brow raised in surprise, as his hand was now in a rather tight grip. Both men's dark gaze loomed over him. Cut the bullshit. Again, he was flabbergasted. This time not from the bluntness of the words, but rather the speaker. Gigi. He wanted to shout the words, but all that came out was a soft breath, as his eyes squeezed shut. No, he wouldn't let his mask fall here. He blinked the burning in his eyes away and swallowed hard, forcing the lump in his throat down. The lump in his throat shot back up and he swallowed again. Sarutobi rose a brow in questioning. He steeled himself and laced his voice with as much innocence as he could as he forced the words out of his mouth. You have to put a coin in the swear jar. He looked at the man and just nearly flinched. The man was enraged with his reply. This is the end, Go down fighting then. No, no, no. He rose his voice with each word. The first mask crumbled, the first of two. This was his second, his last chance. It won't fucking be this way. If I'm not allowed to wear a mask here, then neither is this son of a bitch. He screeched while he whipped his hand up to the ANDU's mask. Needless to say, he was easily stopped. The soft voice of Sarutobi filled the room. He'll take off his mask once you really take off yours. The words hit him like a freight truck. His masks crumbled so easily? Why were his cheeks warm? He reached up and wiped with the back of his hand. Tears. When had he started crying? His hands were instantly freed and he found them around Sarutobi. His face was in the man's chest and he sobbed. The 3 years of understanding the hate, from 2 years old, and the one of understanding why. 3 years of pent-up tears sprung from his eyes into the man's robe. He stayed like that for an hour. Neither of the other men in the room made a move or a sound. Suddenly he felt the room thick with heavy guilt, which he would question later. His thoughts were finally reined in as his emotions had taken control of his actions before. Finally, someone I can trust. Wait, the Anbu. He turned his head to glance at the man he thought of, who was currently gripping the table where he had lay a moment before, his head down in near shame. He couldn't stop himself as he spoke, the childlike attitude that had melded with his intelligence, maturity, and hatred finally revealing itself again. It's okay, Dog-san, it's not your fault. He spoke softly and slowly and unsurely released his tight grip on the Hokage, which he was sure the man was thankful for, and scooted across the short table to the Anbu. You're the one who was following me, right? He reached slowly, wrapping his arms around the man's stomach and pulling him into a tight hug as well. Wouldn't have guessed they would send an Anbu after me though. He added quietly, just so he could hear, which seemed to make the man stiffen, if possible, even more than from the hug. After a few moments he gave a tight, reassuring squeeze and let go. He looked at the man, behind the mask and gave a huge smile, looking at him mischievously before whispering an almost eerie sounding, your turn. To him, the man looked at him before he shook his head. HMPH, goddamn liar Gigi. He shot in Sarutobi's direction before scoot to the edge of the table and hanging his legs over the edge, swinging them slightly back and forth. He thought he had heard him laugh for a second, but quickly dismissed the sound. Gigi never laughed. He could however hear the unusual amount of breath the masked man let out at once. A suppressed laugh? I may never know. He thought in realization. Train and train hard. That had become his personal mantra for the past few months since his ruse had been discovered. He noticed the lack of Anbu presence and found it to be particularly disturbing. While Anbu was distinctly lacking, the few times he had noticed them had only been to his chakra sensing ability that he had worked almost night and day to obtain. The way that he had seen it is, if in some way the seal weakened and Kyuubi chakra had been allowed to escape, he would have at least been able to sense when it was happening. There also came the added bonus of discovering his Anbu guards when a few rookies got lazy enough for him to be able to sense him. He had been sculpting not only his physical body recently, but his mental one as well. He had been building various personalities, and had acquired a good number of 13 to put up as defense to people trying to interact with him. He discovered early that people weren't to be trusted nor were they to be allowed within his circle of precious people, as they were nothing but petty liars, wanting to get him what he deserved, as they called it. Fuck them. While he had found it impossible to get into the local library to gain his intelligence, as no one would let him near the books, sneaking in was no large feat, as no one had bothered to keep a watch at the library. What thief would want to raid a library? Peeved, yay, that's probably what they thought. He reassured himself viciously. He was the proud thief who had made it mandatory for there to be at least one Chunin-level shinobi at the library at all times, both during night and day. People had assumed him, of course, although, this time they were right. They had whispered that the demon wanted to learn their weaknesses. He chuckled a bit at the thought. He had read about the Yondaime. Minato Namikaze was his name. No pictures of the man that he could find, sadly. He hadn't hated the man, and while he was reading about him he only found that he had an unnerving admiration towards him. He was a genius. Something had caught his attention though. While all the public books had read that the man sacrificed himself to kill the beast, it had ironically decided that it was the perfect moment to speak up. Flashback. He skimmed over the book he had recently stolen quickly. They would have to be returned eventually, lest someone become suspicious. As he read the line, he became increasingly interested. Why did the book tell a lie? The Kyuubi was sealed in him. He spoke to the damn thing. So why did it say that the Yondaime had sacrificed himself to kill the beast? Investigation into the incident later. He mentally noted. He suddenly fell forward, a black enveloping him as he couldn't even cry out for help. Naruto's inner mind. He panted heavily on his hands and knees with water coming up just past his wrist. He took a few shuddering, deep breaths and crawled up to his feet. Why am I in here? He thought, asking no one. He nearly dropped a brick in his pants when he got a response. I brought you here. He turned slowly to address the only open, huge red eye behind the sky-touching bars. Listen, you. He clenched his fists into balls in front of him, gritting his teeth before relaxing and looking inquiringly at the fox. He spoke softly, keeping his voice terse but understanding. Since you dragged me here as I was in the middle of something, it must be important. I will keep this nice, but before we begin I have 2 questions. He stopped, waiting to see if the demon before him had something to say before continuing. First, what would you like for me to call you? The fox stiffened at the question but relaxed again almost an instant later, a movement unrecognized by the boy. Second, he frowned, a blush crawling its way onto his cheeks as he asked with a childlike tone and curiosity. You can hear my thoughts? He finished quietly, obviously embarrassed. The fox was quiet for a long while and he opened his mouth to say something before he heard a deep, resounding, and booming noise. Laughter. He sat with a tick mark appearing on his forehead, a scowl evident on his face as he watched the gleaming white teeth disappear as the fox seemingly calmed down. Ah, you're funny kid. Seems you're not as devoid of your innocence as you let on. Anyway, yes, I can hear your thoughts. As for my name, the fox shifted, a bit uncomfortable, it seemed. Damn kid is bringing up memories meant to be forgotten. Is unimportant. It finished bluntly, leaving the boy slightly baffled. Before he could speak, however, he sent the boy back into his consciousness. No more stupid questions, boy. I'm sick of you already. Leave my sight. End flashback. He sighed at the memory. They were just getting to chat together too. Him and his stupid questions. He slowly drifted off into his thinking as he stopped his training, the kunai he had just thrown at his makeshift targets missing horribly and flying off into the woods somewhere. Without a word he followed after them, walking past his makeshift targets, which in reality were just a few boxes he found and stacked up on each other, painting a bullseye with some mud that had just the right amount of consistency as to where it wouldn't slide down and just make a brown circle. The clearing he had found was a distance into the woods, around a mile or so out, and wasn't really anything out of the ordinary. He had camped here sometimes, God did he love the outdoors. After a minute or so of searching, he got worried. Those kunai were gifted to him by Gigi, and he would be damned if he had lost them. What seemed like the only gifts he ever got. No getting depressed now, he mentally screamed at himself, adopting a serious expression as he began to search for the kunai that he held so close to his heart, not literally XD. You know, I thought for a second that you had tried to hit me with those kunai, Naruto-kun. An ear-to-ear grin broke out on his face as he turned to the sound of the voice, a man sitting on the low branch of a tree behind him, twirling his 3 kunai between his fingers expertly. A dog mask covered his face, and his voice was lazy, as if bored of being here already. Dog-san, he squealed with delight and raced over, tackling the man in the mask. The kunai in the man's hand all landed beside them, tips embedded in the ground harmlessly, courtesy of the Anbu member he was currently hugging, of course. He squeezed the man tight, happy to see him back and alive. During one of their previous moments like this, Inu, as he wanted to be called, had explained to him the basics behind Anbu missions, and that he might not even come back one of the times. The thought had deterred him from getting too attached to the man, but they still kept a more than friendly relation. The Anbu may as well have been his brother with how well he treated him. Inu made an oomph sound as he was tackled, and then grumbled something that sounded suspiciously like, "I told you not to call me that," soon after. He still lightly rested a hand on Naruto's back. The fact that Naruto had gotten close enough to even touch him was a sentiment to their relationship alone. Anyone else would have been sliced open already for getting too close, yet here Naruto was, clinging to the man as Inu carried him back to his special training clearing. With a single arm wrapped around Inu's neck to keep himself up, he slipped the 3 kunai back into their pouch that was strapped to his thigh, fitted to size and blending in quite well with the slightly ragged and worn brown shorts while his white t-shirt slung to him with sweat. As they reached the clearing, he slid off of Inu's back, placed his hands on his hips and gave him a large smile. He knew something was wrong. Inu hadn't spoken to him once on the walk to the clearing, and seemed a bit solemn rather than his usual self. He opened his mouth to ask what was wrong, but it was then that his world came crashing down. "I'm leaving Naruto-kun." The words were blunt and devoid of emotion. His heart broke, but he tried to fight it off. He still had a chance. Just like the first time he broke down, he began to let emotions override his thoughts. What? His voice was small, weak. He wanted to cry and let himself die. A mission, assigned by Lord Hokage-sama himself. Another blunt answer that just rips his heart out. He wanted to shrink into his skin and crawl away. How long? He questioned, the whisper of a voice surprisingly steady. More than a year. He let out a shuddering breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. He looked around the little clearing and despite his young life couldn't help but feel a bit nostalgic. Inu ni. The man looked surprised at the use of his name, then a little sober. "You were the one who helped me discover this place." He waved his arm, gesturing to the clearing. It was his only getaway. The only escape from the torture that he had called a life. The only place he could be alive. "I'll be coming back, Naruto." He gave a weak nod, while his support behind it wasn't really there. He lifted a box that had been used for target practice and sat in on the ground. He sat on it and pulled off his shirt, the jagged scar running across his premature chest. The results of his training would not really be shown until he was a bit older. The scar stretched from the bottom of the left side of his collarbone down to his belly button. A deep wound, given too young for it to be cleared and healed completely, unlike most wounds he got now. He ran a finger over it and flinched, then moved his hand to his shoulder where there was another scar. Less severe, but still put on a body too young to heal. The only 2 scars of his life, and they would be with him until he was in his late teens. "I'm gonna miss you, Inu ni. Promise some ramen when you get back?" He glanced at the man, his teeth gritting through his question, tears already sliding down his cheeks and meeting at his chin, dripping down to his shorts silently. "Promise," came the reply with a slight bit of remorse hidden in the undertone. This was the man who'd told him to look underneath the underneath, after all. As the man who he had become the closest of friends with disappeared in a burst of chakra and a shunshin, he cradled his own head in his 2 hands, covering his eyes from the outside world. None would look in, he wouldn't look out. He remained like this for 2 days, before gathering his belongings, washing and heading into town to find Ichiraku's. He vowed to be strong when just a month later Gigi had told him that the Enbu agent known as Inu was dead. He trained non-stop. Even when he wasn't conscious anymore, he was in his mind, trying to start conversations with the Kyuubi. Of course the furball rejected him every single time, so he just delved into books. He had read most of the important stuff out of the library. By important stuff, this meant literally half the books in there. He read the history of the village, most of the ninja techniques and such. He could just never figure the damn things out. After finishing the last shinobi-relevant book in the library, he was browsing when he saw something that caught his eye. The title read, "Taming a Fox." Beginner's Guide. He was giggling for the first time since Inu left when he plucked the book off the shelf and began to skim through it. He could practically feel the waves of irritation coming off of the fox inside him when he realized what the boy was looking through. He rolled his eyes and put the book carefully back on the shelf, as it hadn't really interested him anyway. The only other book in the library that caught his attention was quite a shocker. written by Asanin, Jiraiya. His surprise furthered when he saw the main protagonist's name, Naruto. He regained his senses a moment later and picked the book up off the ground. Yes, it surprised him enough to drop the book, and stuffed it inside his jacket. A later times read, maybe I should look further into this Sanin's work? He thought as he browsed the library some more for the artist's name. Eventually he went up to the front desk and played his first mask. The fool. Hi there, I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Believe it, he played the part well, and seeing him as an idiot usually took a bit of pressure off of the villagers when talking to him. Although he did actually favor the catchphrase, he loved it when he saw the incredulous look on their faces when he used the quote. With a silent thank you to who knows what when he saw the librarian was a young girl, he went ahead with his question. Do you have any more books by a man named Jiraiya? A slap crossed his face and he was so shocked that even without acting he reached up to touch his cheek. Pervert, she yelled before pointing out the door of the library. He complied immediately and walked out with a thinking look on his face. 8 years old, he had come up with the idea of forest trips just a year ago, and he would leave the village for a month about every 3 months since beginning to go on them. He couldn't rate how strong he was. He had no one to fight against, and the taijutsu style he had was basically something someone could use in a street brawl. Self-training could only go so far, and he had reached the limit of his 8-year-old body. He really felt like there was nothing more he could do. After having found the memorial stone, he started going to it almost every week. He hadn't known why, but something just drew him to it. He traced his fingers over the carved names in the stone and rested on the name of his fathers. Minato Namikaze. Oh yeah, he had found out, and he was pissed. The damn fox fessed up during one of their God, it sounds like I'm friends with him or something, he mused, chuckling lightly to himself as he ran his thumb over his father's name. In fact, the fox and him had grown quite close to each other, although he couldn't speak for the fox. When the fox let it slip that he was just like his parents, he had kept pestering until he finally spat it out. It was a shock to say the least. His looks grew distant as his eyes focused back on the name, and he had to swallow a lump in his throat. No more tears. He had gained more secrets than a person could imagine, and he set off towards the tower of the man who knew most of them as well. The tower of the man he called Gigi. The tower of the Hokage. He had a request to make, and he was sure it would be answered. A smile danced his lips and he closed his eyes slightly as he hummed a tune, Rufus Wainwright Hallelujah. He had learned from a traveling man, as it seemed to fit the tone when he ignored the glares of the villagers and the sneers of their arrogant children. The Hokage stared at him with a steady, calculating gaze. He shifted on his feet a bit as he looked at the ground, embarrassed with his question. Soon, Hiruzen had stood up and was next to him, squeezing his biceps and all the other important muscles of his body softly. Even though he had understood what the man was doing, he couldn't help but be weirded out. Ah, Gigi, what the hell are you doing? He asked accusingly with a twitching eye as he leapt back, away from the man. Even the Anbu hidden in the room seemed to be creeped out, as one of them almost blew their cover when they fell out of the disguise for just a moment. The man merely gave him a gentle smile. Well, Naruto-kun, it seems you have been through some rigorous training recently. He spoke softly, but had put an emphasis on the word rigorous that did not go unnoticed by Naruto. Yay, I have to train to be able to take that hat from you, old man. He replied boastfully, not trusting of the Anbu in the room. The man pretended to be hurt and walked slowly back to his desk, muttering, I'm not that old, under his breath as he went. As the Hokage sat down, he waited and listened. So Naruto, you want to be enrolled in the academy not this year, but the next? When you're 9 to be exact. He nodded his head excitedly as the man continued. Interesting choice. Well, we had plans to do so anyways. Hiruzen finished. He was still nodding his head but with a frown on his face, and as soon as his head slowed and stopped he tilted it backwards and let out a groan. I came here for nothing then. He all but shouted at the man. He didn't even wait for an answer as he turned and stomped out of the room, stopping for a brief second at the door to call over his shoulder. Get me when it's time, before leaving. After leaving a note at his house that explained what he was doing and where he began the trek to his clearing. A whole year of training. I wonder what this will do for me when I come back, he mused to himself as he stepped over a log and around a bush, following the path to the clearing he had been using for each of his forest trips. The clearing that Inu had helped him discover just a few years ago. After reaching the clearing and setting up, he had a small fire, a hidden shelter in the trees, and a small storage area for food.
Like and subscribe for next part.